The storm's roar was deafening, crashing against the train's metal frame as water surged beneath the floorboards. Panic flooded the train, escalating with every inch the waters crept upwards. Passengers were scrambling, yelling, and some were even attempting to stack their belongings in a futile attempt to stop the water from invading further. The rhythmic sound of rushing water mixed with the frantic cries of people filled the air, each voice growing more desperate as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. A loud, frantic voice from the conductor blared through the intercom, "Stay calm. We're doing everything we can." But the urgency in his voice only amplified the sense of dread in the cabin. Every minute the water rose higher, sloshing around passengers' feet. With each passing second, their hope dwindled. There was no way out. The train was stuck, isolated on flooded tracks in the middle of nowhere. Ella could feel the tension, the weight of the situation pressing against her chest. The storm outside raged like an unstoppable force, but inside, the chaos was even worse. The storm was relentless, and with it, the growing realization that the help they needed might never come. Ella sat in her seat, barely aware of the chaos around her. The storm's fury pressed against the windows, but her mind was far away, caught in a place where nothing felt real. The recent loss of her husband still hung over her like a thick fog, and the emotions she had not allowed herself to feel in the wake of the funeral now roared to life. She reached out mechanically, trying to help an elderly woman struggling with an inhaler, but it felt as though she were just going through the motions. Every action felt distant, as if she were a bystander in her own life. The raging storm outside couldn't touch the emptiness she felt inside. Her heart ached with the weight of all she had lost, and in that moment she could not escape the quiet loneliness of her grief. The passengers' cries and the sound of water sloshing beneath her feet barely registered in her mind. Her world was numb, and nothing seemed to matter until the loudspeaker crackled again. "Help is on the way," the conductor's voice echoed, but the words were empty, as hollow as the cabin itself. Ella's mind drifted back to the present. The train was trapped on flooded tracks, and with each passing moment, the water seemed to rise higher. Panic spread like wildfire. A mother clutched her child, her voice shaking with fear. An older man tried to open the windows, futilely struggling against the seal, but it was useless. Water was everywhere now, rushing over the floorboards. The air was thick with desperation. Ella's thoughts flickered back to her late husband. He had always known how to stay calm, how to solve problems. She had leaned on him, trusted him, but now she was alone. Alone in the middle of this storm, with nothing but her own grief to guide her. Then, amidst the chaos and the rising panic, a bark pierced the air sharp, distinct and urgent. It didn't belong here, not in the midst of this flood, not among these strangers. Ella stiffened, looking up sharply. Could it be the sound cut through the roar of the storm, louder now, a voice desperate for attention? She frowned, doubting herself. She must be imagining things, but the sound lingered, growing louder, more insistent. It was real. Ella's heart raced as the realization hit. This wasn't her mind playing tricks on her. Someone or something was trapped. She could feel it. The growling storm, the panicked voices, and then the bark again, unmistakable now, echoing from the back of the train. For the first time since the flood began, Ella was fully present. The noise tugged her away from the isolation her grief had wrapped her in. She hesitated for a moment, still unsure. Was it a dog? Was she imagining it? Another bark, louder, sharper. The sound cut through the haze of her numbness like a thread. pulling her towards something. She couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't her grief calling. It was a living creature in need. And that gave her purpose. Again. Ella stood up slowly, the weight of the decision settling over her. Her eyes scanned the flood-filled cabin. The passengers were all too focused on their own fears, but her focus had shifted. There was someone or something who needed her. She began moving towards the back of the train. Every step felt heavier as Ella made her way down the corridor, the water reaching her ankles, then her shins, then higher. The noise around her, cries, the relentless rain faded as she neared the back of the train. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath shallow. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the barking was louder now, almost frantic. Something was wrong. Whatever was on the other side of that door, it was in distress. The train's corridor was in chaos. Luggage was scattered, and the water was rising steadily. Panic had taken hold of the passengers here, too. Yet, Ella's only focus was the sound ahead. It was an instinct, drawing her closer despite her growing unease. And then, at the rear of the train, she found it. The door to the last car, and the noise, the barking was so loud now, it sent a chill down her spine. She hesitated. Could she really do this? Could she put herself in danger for someone she didn't even know? Her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, pushing it open slowly. As the door creaked open, the sight before Ella struck her like a punch to the gut. A German shepherd, soaked to the bone, was chained to a metal rail. The water had already risen past its paws, and the dog was desperately trying to free itself, barking frantically. Its strong, well-built body was shaking with fear. Ella froze for a heartbeat, her mind racing. What was this dog doing here? The train wasn't a pet transport, but the dog's eyes, those eyes filled with panic and helplessness, pulled her forward. Her heart softened instantly. This wasn't just a dog. It was someone in need. A living being who had been left behind, abandoned in the rising floodwaters. Ella's instincts kicked in. She moved toward the dog cautiously, her hands outstretched. The dog growled, a low warning. Its fur matted and wet, but its eyes froze. Eyes begged her for help. Ella reached for the chain. She didn't hesitate now. She had to help. Ella pressed forward, water now knee-deep in the train. Her flashlight flickered once more, casting only brief, shaky glimmers of light before it dimmed again. Every step felt heavier as the water rushed around her, seeping into her shoes and up her legs. Her muscles burned from the effort, the strain of pushing through the chaos of a sinking train. Around her, the sound of panicked voices echoed, drowning in the relentless storm outside. A child's wail, a woman shouting at the conductor. The tension was thick in the air, but Ella didn't pause. She had to move forward. She didn't know what was ahead, but there was something else in the air, too. A sound, desperate cut through the turmoil of the storm, pulling her deeper into the train. Her mind raced. Who or what was in trouble? She didn't know, but that sound, like a call for help, urged her on as she reached the far end of the train. The noise grew louder, more frantic, and Ella's heart quickened in response. She had to find out what it was. The door to the last car groaned as Ella struggled to open it, the water rushing inside, making every motion feel labored. When it finally gave, a rush of stale, humid air filled her lungs, and the sight that met her took her breath away. A German shepherd was trap-chained to a metal rail, its fur drenched and tangled, its paws submerged in the rising floodwaters. The dog barked in terror, its body taut with fear, struggling against the restraints. Ella's heart tightened. How could this happen? A dog, chained in this nightmare, abandoned in a flooded train. She was no expert, but it was clear this was no ordinary stray. The dog was well trained, its fear a sign that it had been through more than just the storm. Her eyes locked onto the dog's, and she felt a jolt in her chest. The desperation in those eyes, how could she turn away? For a moment, Ella froze, gripped by uncertainty. The dog growled low, a warning, its body coiled with tension. She hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to make things worse. This animal was trapped in terror, and she didn't know if it would bite her out of fear or trust her. Her heart raced. She could feel the rising water pressing in on her. But it wasn't just the floodwaters she feared. Would the dog attack? She had no way of knowing. Ella took a slow, cautious step forward, her hands trembling as she reached out to the dog. It growled again, louder this time, its body shuddering. Yet she couldn't turn back now. She was the only one who could help. And maybe, just maybe, this dog could trust her. The seconds stretched, each one filled with the deafening bark and the rising panic around her. Finally, she whispered, "It's okay. I'm here to help." And then something happened. The growl stopped. The dog's posture shifted, no longer stiff, but somehow softer. Its eyes wide with fear, locked with Ella's. At that moment, time seemed to stand still. Ella's breath hitched. There was something in those eyes, a silent plea, a quiet recognition that perhaps this stranger was here to help. The moment stretched, fragile and quiet amidst the chaos. Ella didn't move, and neither did the dog. Instead, they stood there too, souls, for a brief second, understanding each other. The fear was still there, but the growl was gone. In its place, there was something else, a fragile trust, a spark of connection. Ella's pulse slowed, her mind clearing. She knew then she couldn't leave this dog behind. She had to help. With a shaky breath, Ella stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she reached for the chain that bound the dog. Her hands felt cold, but she focused, trying not to think about the water that now swelled up to her knees. The dog's wet coat gleamed in the dim light as she gently pulled at the chain. The dog didn't resist, though its eyes remained anxious. It shifted slightly, allowing her to work, but Ella could feel the tension running through its body. As the chain finally gave way, she pulled it free, breathing a soft sigh of relief. Immediately, she draped her jacket over the dog's trembling form, covering its soaked fur with the fabric as a small gesture of warmth. The dog inhaled deeply, its breath steadying. Ella's heart raced. This was real. She was really doing this. She was rescuing the dog. Behind her, passengers began to notice. Some gasped. A few murmured in disbelief. One man spoke up, voice trembling. "Are you... Is it... safe?" Ella turned slightly, her eyes meeting the passengers. She didn't have answers, not yet, but she did have a purpose, and that was enough. With the dog now free, Ella began to lead it through the flooded cabin. Her hands still shook, but the dog, now named Shadow, followed her with surprising trust. Despite the storm, despite the water, the dog stayed close, pressing against her leg for warmth and reassurance. The connection was small, yet undeniable. Shadow moved without hesitation, as though it recognized that Ella wasn't a threat. She guided the dog carefully, step by step, toward higher ground inside the train. As they moved, Ella felt something change in her. Her heart, once closed off in grief, began to soften, the weight of the storm outside momentarily forgotten. The dog's presence, its quiet trust, soothed her in ways she hadn't realized she needed. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment, she felt less alone. The bond was forming, fragile but real, and it was a bond that would change both of them forever. The storm outside had become an all-consuming force, raging and howling against the train's fragile structure. Inside, the rising waters had reached their highest point yet. Ella, guiding Shadow through the chaos, finally found a small group of passengers huddled together in the farthest corner of the car. They had managed to find a dry spot, but their faces were filled with fear and uncertainty. Ella's heart went out to them. People with no control over the storm that had trapped them all. The only comfort she could offer was her presence. Sitting down with Shadow by her side, she placed a gentle hand on his wet fur, feeling his shiver. He looked up at her with soft, trusting eyes, as though understanding the gravity of the situation. Though the passengers around her were still tense, unsure of what the next moments would bring, Ella found solace in the quiet moment shared between her and Shadow. The storm's fury continued outside, but here, in the middle of this uncertainty, Ella had found someone who needed her as much as she needed him. As the minutes dragged on, Ella's focus turned to the passengers. An elderly man sat hunched over, coughing, his breathing shallow. A mother clutched her child tightly, tears streaking her face. The overwhelming sense of helplessness seemed to press down on everyone. Ella quickly moved to the injured, her nurse instincts kicking in. But as she worked, something unexpected happened. Shadow, who had been resting quietly by her side, suddenly stirred. He moved across the small group, his eyes scanning the room with an alertness Ella had come to expect. Then, with surprising gentleness, he nudged a shivering child who had fallen asleep in her mother's arms. The child stirred, her eyes blinking open, and Shadow licked her hand. Offering comfort without hesitation, Ella paused for a moment, watching this simple act of kindness. The dog, once a stranger, had become something more, a silent, steady presence. In the storm, every time the water leaked through again, Shadow would bark loudly, alerting the group to the rising danger. He was no longer just a survivor of the storm. He was now a protector, actively participating in the survival of the group. Ella smiled softly, grateful for the unexpected kindness that had come from Shadow. She realized then he wasn't just here to help her. He was here to help all of them. As Ella continued to tend to the passengers, her mind drifted back to her past. She had always been afraid to open her heart again after the tragic loss of her husband. He had been a canine officer, their bond formed not just in marriage but in shared work. She'd spent years by his side, watching him train their family Dogon. Obedient, loyal companion. The memories flooded in their shared laughter, their quiet moments at the end of a long day, the way the dog had sensed her husband's moods. It had been perfect. But that was before the accident had taken them both, the dog and her husband, leaving Ella alone in a way that she hadn't known was possible. The pain of losing them both at once had left an emotional scar she hadn't been able to heal. The idea of bonding with another dog felt impossible. She couldn't bear the thought of going through that kind of pain again. But as she watched Shadow now, his eyes full of trust, his actions kind and genuine, Ella felt something stir in her heart. Maybe this wasn't about replacing what she lost. Maybe it was about accepting the love that was in front of her now. She knew, deep down, that Shadow wasn't her husband's dog, and yet, in some strange, unexpected way, he was helping her heal, A sudden thunderclap shook the entire train, the force of it reverberating through the metal walls. The noise was deafening, and in an instant, Shadow bolted. His muscles tensed as his paws splashed through the rising water, his movements frantic, desperate. Ella's heart jumped in her chest. She had barely time to react before he was gone, tearing through the flooded corridor, the sound of his frantic barks echoing in the distance. Shadow. Ella called, panic rising in her throat. She moved quickly, pushing through the water, her eyes scanning the dimly lit cabin. She wasn't sure where he had gone, but she couldn't lose him not now. The storm roared louder, but she called his name again, her voice steady despite the rush of fear inside. She didn't know where he'd gone, but the quiet bond between them was stronger than any storm, any fear. She trusted that he would hear her. Finally, she found him, panting, his body pressed against the farthest wall of the train, his eyes wide but soft as he met her gaze. His fear hadn't disappeared, but in that moment Ella knew it had lessened. She approached slowly, letting him see her calm presence. She didn't need to rush, didn't need to force him. Ella kneeled down, holding out a biscuit she'd found in the supplies earlier. Slowly, hesitantly, Shadow approached, sniffing the air. Then, in one fluid motion, he moved forward and gently took the treat from her hand. "Good boy," Ella whispered softly, her heart swelling with pride. It was a small step, but it was enough. She had earned his trust, and he had given her his. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and the train continued to sway dangerously on the tracks. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. A roof panel had collapsed, sending more water flooding into the already soaked cabin. The group shouted in alarm as they scrambled to avoid the rising tide. Ella quickly turned to help, her eyes scanning the room. There was a child, a small girl, shivering violently, her lips turning blue from the cold. The rising water was pushing everyone into corners, and Ella had to act fast. She turned to Shadow, who was by her side, watching her intently. Without a word, he nudged the child gently, offering warmth in the midst of chaos. Ella didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees, wrapping the child in her arms and beginning the process of warming her. Shadow stayed close, watching as Ella worked, his presence like a reassuring hug in the storm. With each passing second, the bond between them grew stronger. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a team effort. The passengers who had once feared the dog began to watch with new respect. Ella and Shadow, working together, were saving lives. Later, as the waters began to recede slightly, Ella sat down on a small dry spot, her body exhausted. Shadow was lying by her side, resting his head on his paws, while she petted him. Her hand brushed against something hard beneath his fur. She pulled at the matted coat and found a small dog tag, its surface scratched and worn. A name was barely visible, but it had been etched out, as if someone had wanted to forget. Ella stared at the tag, her mind racing. Who would abandon such a loyal, well-trained dog? Her heart ached for Shadow even more now. His past was a mystery, one that seemed tied to his own abandonment and survival. This discovery didn't change the bond. Between them it only deepened it. Shadow had been through so much, and despite everything, he was still here, still loyal, still trusting, and so was she. Maybe they were both learning to trust again, in each other and in the possibility of second chances. As the storm continued to rage outside, the group fell into a strange silence. Everyone was exhausted, but there was a new understanding in the air. The once frantic atmosphere had softened. Ella sat beside Shadow, his wet fur now dry against her leg. He rested there, leaning into her for warmth. For the first time since her husband's death, Ella allowed herself to feel something beyond the weight of grief connection. It wasn't easy, but in this moment, with the dog beside her, Ella finally let herself be present. Shadow, his body pressing closer to hers, seemed to understand. They sat there in the quiet storm, an unspoken bond growing stronger between them. It wasn't perfect. It was raw, just like their emotions. But it was real. In that silence, Ella knew something had changed in her. She was no longer alone in the world, and maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry all the weight by herself. Shadow had become her companion, and she had become his. Together, they had found a new kind of healing. The crackling of the emergency radio filled the cabin, cutting through the frantic noise of the passengers. Ella's heart sank as the voice on the radio delivered devastating news. Rescue teams are delayed. Floodwaters are rising faster than anticipated. Help won't reach us for another 6 hours. The words echoed in Ella's mind, growing louder. With each passing second, the storm outside and the rising floodwaters were enough to make anyone feel helpless. But now they were faced with the cold, hard truth: they were trapped. She glanced around at the passengers, their faces etched with fear. Some were crying, others shouting, all in a desperate attempt to make sense of the nightmare they were caught in. Panic spread through the cabin like wildfire, each passing minute making their situation worse. Ella closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to focus. She had to remain calm. She had to keep the passengers calm. But the pressure was mounting, and the weight of the unknown was heavy on her chest. "Listen to me," she called, raising her voice over the chaos. "We need to stay together. We'll figure this out. Stay calm. Help is on the way." But even as she spoke, her own doubt crept in. Would help really come? Or were they on their own? The storm raged louder outside, the floodwaters rising ever faster. Panic was beginning to consume them all. Just as Ella began organizing the evacuation, the train shook violently. A loud crack sounded from the back of the cabin, followed by a flare of bright light. The radio crackled again, and the words that followed sent a jolt through Ella's spine. "The power conduit has been breached. Fire in the back car." The air became thick with smoke, and the passengers screamed in terror. The storm outside seemed a mere whisper compared to the immediate threat now inside the train. The floodwaters were already pushing everyone to their limits, but now they were facing the possibility of fire. Shadow, who had been sitting by Ella's side, suddenly stood, his fur bristling. He began barking urgently, and Ella, now fully on edge, could see the smoke beginning to fill the cabin. "Everyone, move to the front," she shouted, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to move quickly." The fire spread swiftly, fueled by the debris in the cabin. Ella's mind raced. How long until the fire spreads further? What if they didn't make it out? The uncertainty threatened to overwhelm her, but she fought to push those thoughts away. The passengers scrambled in panic, some tripping over each other, others frozen in fear. Ella moved quickly, ushering them forward, but it was hard to ignore. The escalating danger. The air was thick with smoke, and every moment felt like a ticking clock. The narrow train corridors were a nightmare. As Ella led the passengers toward the emergency roof hatch, the water surged higher, pressing against their legs. The fear was palpable, thick in the air. The sense of urgency had escalated to a frantic panic. Ella glanced back to see a mother, clutching her child, both trembling, but when she looked again, they had disappeared. Her heart skipped a beat. Where had they gone? She stopped in her tracks. A child was missing. In the chaos of evacuation, someone had slipped away, unnoticed. Panic surged through Ella. She couldn't leave without ensuring every person was accounted. For not again. Where's the child? She yelled to the others, her voice full of urgency. Has anyone seen the little girl? No one responded. The group continued to move forward, but their eyes were wide with terror. Some were too afraid to answer. Ella's heart began to pound. Time was slipping away. Without warning, Shadow bolted. His body tensed as he dashed down the flooded train corridor, moving faster than Ella had ever seen him move. Shadow, Ella cried, panic rising in her throat. She didn't hesitate. She took off after him, wading through the water, the smoky air burning her lungs. What had spooked him? Was it the fire, or had he found something? Shadow's barking echoed down the corridor, and Ella's heart leapt into her throat. He wasn't just running aimlessly. He had a purpose. Finally, Ella saw him. He was at the snack cart, his body low, his nose nudging a small, unconscious child. The water was nearly up to the child's neck. Shadow, Ella cried, rushing forward. The dog stopped, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, there was something almost human in his gaze. Ella knelt down beside the child, her fingers trembling as she checked for a pulse. She could feel the child's cold skin, the signs of hypothermia. She had to act fast. Shadow stayed close, never leaving her side, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He wasn't just her helper. He was her lifeline in this moment of chaos. The smoke was thick, choking the air. Ella could barely see, but she trusted Shadow. They had to get this child to safety. Her hands shook as she carefully lifted the child, holding her close. Shadow, calm and steady, followed her as she made her way toward the hatch. His presence was a constant, a grounding force amid the swirling panic and rising waters. Every step was a struggle. The child was limp in her arms, the weight of her body a constant reminder of the urgency. The water continued to rise, but Shadow's steady presence beside her gave Ella the strength she needed. They moved together, each one relying on the other. She couldn't have done it without him as they reached the hatch. Shadow's barking echoed through the smoke-filled cabin. Help was close. They reached the hatch, but just as Ella reached for the handle, a surge of water broke through, knocking her off balance. The hatch was stuck. Desperation clawed at her chest. No, not now. Not after everything they had been through. But then, in the midst of the chaos, Shadow leapt up and nudged the child upward. His strength surprising Ella, she pushed against the water, fighting the rising panic. They had to get out. With a final, desperate push, the hatch opened just enough for the child to be pulled through. Ella barely had time to catch her breath before the voice of the rescue team echoed from above. Hold on, we're here. The long wait for rescue was finally over. The helicopter arrived quickly, lifting the passengers to safety one by one. When Ella and Shadow were pulled up, Ella held him tight, her body shaking with relief. You saved us, she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. Shadow's fur was still wet, his body exhausted, but he leaned into her, resting his head on her lap. The storm continued to rage below, but in that moment, Ella knew that she had found something she'd never thought she'd have again, someone she could rely on, someone who had never given up on her. Shadow had saved them all, and, in doing so, had given Ella the chance to heal. The helicopter blades hummed above them, cutting through the storm as they were lifted to safety. Ella sat on the metal bench, her body still trembling from the events that had unfolded. Shadow was beside her, his warm body a silent comfort as the chaos around them started to subside. The shrill voices of the rescue team and the clamor of survivors had faded into a low murmur as they arrived at the emergency shelter inside. The once panic-stricken passengers were now exhausted, some sitting quietly in a daze, others gently whispering prayers. The noise of the world outside seemed far away, replaced by a soft, unspoken relief. Ella found a cot and collapsed onto it, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of her exhaustion. Shadow didn't leave her side. He stretched out next. To her, his head resting on her lap, his soft licks on her hand a quiet reminder that they were no longer alone in the world. Ella stroked his fur absently, still processing everything they had just been through. It wasn't over. Not yet, but in this brief moment of calm, she allowed herself a breath. She wasn't alone anymore. Shadow's presence, his silent understanding, his loyalty anchored her to this fragile new reality. They were safe, and somehow they were together. The story of the miracle dog of Train 47 quickly spread like wildfire across news outlets. Ella had heard the reports on the radio and seen the headlines flashing across her phone. Shadow was being hailed as a hero. His bravery and loyalty were featured in every broadcast. The story of how he guided Ella and saved the missing child, becoming a symbol of hope in the midst of tragedy. The interviews with the passengers and the rescue team painted a picture of Shadow's heroism, how he had braved the floodwaters, his protective instinct guiding Ella through the chaos, how he had nudged the unconscious child to safety. Sensing danger before anyone else, Ella watched it all, her heart swelling with gratitude for the dog who had saved not just her life, but so many others. But even as the world celebrated Shadow's courage, Ella couldn't help but feel something deeper, more personal. The bond they shared, forged through fire and flood, couldn't be captured in headlines. For Ella, Shadow had become more than a hero. He was family. And that quiet, private connection was worth more than any recognition could offer. Just when Ella thought her life was returning to some semblance of normal, the past came knocking. A week after the rescue, a man arrived at her doorstep, claiming to be Shadow's original owner. He said he had been searching for his dog, and now, after seeing the news, he wanted him back. Ella's heart sank at the thought of losing Shadow. He had become her constant, her source of strength, and the thought of him being taken from her was unbearable. She had no idea what kind of life Shadow had endured before, but she knew he hadn't been treated well. With a heavy heart, she agreed to meet the man and check the ownership records. It didn't take long for the truth to emerge. The man had been neglecting Shadow, keeping him in a confined space, starving him, and then discarding him when he no longer served a purpose. Ella's resolve hardened. Shadow wasn't going back to that life. Supported by the passengers who had witnessed Shadow's bravery and the rescue team's testimony, she fought for custody, determined to keep her dog safe, no matter the cost. After a hard-fought legal battle, Ella was granted full custody of Shadow. The moment the judge's gavel came down, Ella felt a surge of relief. It wasn't just about winning. It was about the future she now had with this dog. Shadow was hers, and she was his. A few days later, Ella and Shadow took a quiet walk together. In the woods behind her home, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting long golden shadows on the path ahead. Shadow bounded ahead, chasing after birds with his usual exuberance, but always circling back to her side. He never strayed too far, always aware of her presence. Ella smiled, her heart full. She had thought she would never be able to open her heart again. But Shadow had shown her that healing wasn't about replacing what was lost, was about embracing the new, finding love in the unlikeliest of places. She knelt down and with a trembling hand attached a new tag to Shadow's collar. Shadow found loved, home. The words felt like a promise she was ready to keep for as long as he would let her. Together, they were finally home. The storm raged outside, but inside, amid the chaos and rising floodwaters, Ella found something she hadn't expected. As she crouched beside Shadow, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing next to hers, something shifted. In the darkest moments of their ordeal, Ella realized that their bond was more than just a rescue. It was a reminder that sometimes the strength we need doesn't come from the safety of plans or the comfort of familiarity, but from the courage to face the unknown together. The water swirled around them, but Shadow never hesitated. He was there with her, and that alone gave her the strength to keep going. Once abandoned, Shadow had now become the source of her strength. They were both survivors, learning that courage is not just about surviving. It's about trusting the unexpected connections that can bring hope when everything else seems lost. It wasn't the safety they had planned for, but the trust they had found in each other that ultimately saved them. Both, as the storm subsided, Ella sat in silence, watching Shadow rest by her side. She couldn't help but think of the love she once shared with her husband, a love she thought had disappeared with his passing. But through Shadow, she discovered that love doesn't end with loss. Her love for her husband hadn't vanished. It had transformed, just as her grief had. She wasn't replacing him or their family dog with Shadow. She was opening herself up to a new chapter of love, one that didn't come from mourning the past, but from embracing the future. Shadow's presence reminded her that love isn't something that disappears when someone is gone. It evolves, taking on new shapes and forms. With Shadow by her side, Ella understood that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about allowing herself to love again without fear, without reservation. Through Shadow, Ella learned that love can be a guiding force, leading her from grief toward a place of hope and new beginnings. Shadow's journey had been long and hard, one that no one could have predicted. Abandoned, forgotten, discarded, but through his journey, Ella saw the truth that Shadow embodied. Every life has inherent value when given the opportunity to grow and heal. When Ella first rescued him, Shadow was a stranger, a dog in need of help. But now, as she sat with him, she saw the transformation. The dog who had once been thrown away had become a hero. His story was a living testament to second chances, the power of giving someone, or something, a chance to thrive despite its past. Through Shadow's resilience and her willingness to embrace him, Ella understood that her own worth was not determined by the past. It was determined by the opportunities she gave herself and others to heal, to grow, and to find their place in the world again. Shadow had found his home in Ella, and she had found hers in him. They were both learning that value doesn't come from the past. It comes from the opportunity to begin anew. As the days passed, the weight of their shared experiences settled into a quiet understanding between Ella and Shadow. They had faced danger together. They had built trust when there was no guarantee. They had both overcome grief, fear, and the unknown. And through it all, they had found resilience in each other. Their bond had become the foundation of their survival, not just through the flood, but through everything that had led them to this point. Trust had been the bridge between them, and Resilience had given them the strength to cross it. In the darkest of storms, when it seemed like hope had been swallowed by the waters, they found light not in rescue or salvation, but in their connection. That bond had guided them through the darkest hours and shown them that even in moments of fear, there was a light worth fighting for. Ella realized that their connection wasn't just a lifeline in the storm. It was the clarity, the hope that guided them toward a future where they could heal together. It was the quiet knowledge that, no matter what came next, they had each other, and that was enough.